Welcome back to PatBar LSAT Prep. In this video, we continue our presentation of Section 2 of PrepTest 76. Question 10 presents the argument that since the African elephant has at least 2 feet on the ground at all times, it can walk fast but not actually run. You must find the answer that allows the conclusion to follow logically. This one is as easy as it looks. 2 of the answers are completely irrelevant. One uses the wrong criterion, and one straight up contradicts the conclusion. Since the argument is that feet on the ground does not equal running, it could only be supported by the assumption that feet off the ground does. And whether all feet are off the ground may have been a detail that made you hesitate, but that's irrelevant to the argument's conclusion. B is correct. Question 11 concerns a hardware store and 2 brands of hammers that usually sell about the same. One brand is moved to the store entrance and put on sale, but the other still outsells it. Which of the answers then would best explain that result if that answer is true? Let's start by eliminating a couple that not only do not help, but are actually irrelevant. Since we're not presented with an argument supporting either hammer being of better quality than the other, even if B is true, it makes no difference. How does a special trip to the store help? We're told about an in-store display, not any additional advertising for people not there yet. E cannot be right. C simply contradicts the results. If customers who had bought brand A mentioned the sale to other potential customers, then why did brand B outsell brand A anyway? Same problem with D. If the hardware store circulated flyers advertising brand A, why did brand B perform better anyway? This cannot explain the result. A is the only one that could explain the results if it's true that customers didn't notice the display. Question 12 discusses an experiment using 2 groups of mice, one of which was given a ginkgo extract. That group is presented as being more likely than the other to remember how to navigate a maze. We're then presented with the results of other studies that suggest ginkgo may have reduced stress in mice rather than directly enhancing their memory. Our task is to determine which of the possible answers would most weaken that argument. Once again, several of these are actually irrelevant. For example, we're told specifically about the effects of ginkgo, not the doses. Whether more or less makes no difference without any supporting evidence, and this passage offers none. Whether some chemical substances temporarily impair memory is also irrelevant, since the details within the passage are all specific to ginkgo. C, if true, does not weaken anything we've been given. D is a perfect example of when it may be wise to sit back a moment and think, why would this make a difference? We are already given the results proving that something having to do with ginkgo had an effect on the mice. Does it weaken the argument that we don't know exactly what substances in ginkgo did the job? It does not, and D is incorrect. Did you choose E? If so, go back and read it again. If true that each group took as long as the other to learn how to navigate the maze, this supports the conclusion that the ginkgo helped one group remember it the next day, and has no effect on the argument over what specifically the ginkgo did to help. We are told about studies showing that ginkgo reduces stress in mice, and that recall is known to improve when very high stress levels are reduced. So, if it were true that none of the mice had very high stress levels before they received the ginkgo, that damages the argument. B is correct. Question 13 presents some politicians who strongly supported free trade between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, but who refused to go public with any support for an extension to other Latin American countries. You are to assume the statement to be true and find the answer which then must be true as well. This question specifically tests your ability to not assume that which you are not given. Do they support both? We don't have the specifics to answer that. Do they support one but not the other? Again, we don't know. Are there any politicians who publicly support the extension? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. Have those who won't say changed their position? We don't know. It's quite possible that some politicians publicly oppose the extension, but it's not required to make the statement true. So, if some politicians under the criterion refuse to go public, it has to follow that not all of those politicians will go public. D is correct. Question 14 presents a principle that a person or entity knowingly aiding in copyright infringement is also guilty thereof, and an example of the application of that principle. You are to choose which assumption would most justify the application. The key phrase here is knowingly aiding. Comparing legal obligations doesn't address that at all, nor does an obligation to report, nor does any notice of any kind, nor does monitoring any facilities. For the application of the principle to be justified, the only possible assumption among these answers is that to provide a service that can be used to infringe a copyright should be considered knowingly aiding in that use. Never mind that this seems a faulty conclusion, it's the only one that works. Question 15 presents an argument that while the purpose of journalism is to inform the choices people make, people tend instead to gravitate toward the more sensationalistic gossip that does not affect their lives. A conclusion is begun that the gossip therefore is or does what? You are to find its most logical conclusion. Most likely, you had no trouble with this one. The sensationalistic doesn't prevent the argued purpose, or it wouldn't exist at all. It's not more relevant if you've just argued that it isn't relevant. It does seem to be entertaining, and people certainly can be interested in both journalism and gossip. The argument suggests that the sensationalistic is sometimes included along with the intended purpose. A is correct. Question 16 presents a survey in which respondents chose their preferred party in the legislature and then reaches a conclusion about the survey's results. You are tasked with finding the flaw in the conclusion. This one should be obvious, but let's eliminate the incorrect anyway. The estimates are precise, not rough. E is simply wrong. The argument directly addresses if the results are reliable, so it presumes so. To say that it fails to consider other influences in the face of that presumption is nonsensical. D is incorrect. The argument says nothing about the actual state of affairs, so we don't know whether the results advocate changing anything. A is incorrect. If you chose B, you've actually committed the flaw you've been tasked with finding. The conclusion does not merely restate the premise. What it does instead is take the overall percentages of the entire group of respondents and then apply them as if each individual respondent said the exact same thing as every other respondent. This is the flaw and the correct response. Question 17 features a city leader discussing a tourism plan versus an automobile manufacturing plant and the expected increase in revenue versus the costs. The statements, if they are true, would provide the most support for which answer. Again, we'll throw in a reminder. Phrases like if true or if assumed mean we are to accept something as a given in terms of a problem and its correct response. Also, this is a most support problem for which several answers may appear possible, but only one qualifies as providing the most support. Here again, you want to eliminate first those that don't offer any support. For example, E is absolute nonsense. The city leader argues that the tourism plan and the automobile plant would each create as many jobs, so increasing tourism clearly is not the only way. The least expensive measures available? That's not what the city leader is saying. One of these two options is less expensive, but the least? We're not told if any other options are available, or how good they are, or how much they cost. A presumes facts not in evidence. Speaking generally, it is in fact reasonable to spend the money needed to get an auto manufacturing plant in your city, but that's not what answer B says. Is it reasonable to spend that kind of money only to try to convince a manufacturer? If you're not reasonably sure that the money spent will end with that new facility, would you spend it? And with several manufacturers, how many times? That subtle phrasing on a prep test could mean a city in bankruptcy. The city cannot afford to spend the money to get the plant and implement the tourism plan? Do we know this? The city leader does seem to be framing the statements in terms of what is more cost-effective, but we are not given a pick one scenario. It may make sense to do both. It may make sense to do neither. C, like A, presumes facts not in evidence. So, still presuming the city leader's statements true, if we are told it would be reasonable to spend the money necessary to get that auto plant, it is unquestionably reasonable to adopt the more cost-friendly tourism plan. D is correct. Question 18 presents an article claiming that medical patients can predict sudden changes in their status, then argues that the evidence in support of the article should not be trusted because it is anecdotal. You are to find the one assumption required by that argument. As you may recall, the required assumption question should be posed as, if we presume the assumption false, does the argument fall apart? If not, it's the wrong answer. For example, let's assume that the article will not soon be empirically disproven, that is, disproven by experience, such as the reports of increased birth rates during full moons and how those reports affected the memories of maternity room staff. Does that defeat the argument? It does not, because whether it's soon or years from now, suggesting someone's memories may change over time makes no difference. The argument suggests an analogy, but doesn't say specifically why the article's evidence is anecdotal, and assuming A false does not harm that argument. Let's assume the patients cited in the article were serious when predicting sudden changes in their status. Does the argument fall? Again, no, because that doesn't affect in any way whether that evidence should be trusted, since the article suggests that the ability was in fact there. D suggests the requirement that babies are less likely to be born during a full moon. Assume the opposite, that it's not less likely, and the argument still holds up. The empirical evidence was that they are not more likely, not that they are less likely. D would be irrelevant. E is just wrong. Assuming that an idea is a widely held belief has zero effect on whether an idea is correct. Why is B correct? Again, assume the opposite. If a patient's prediction is more likely to be remembered by medical staff if it doesn't happen, the argument that the evidence is anecdotal collapses. In our next video, we will present questions 19 through 26 of Section 2 of PrepTest 76.